February, and nice new haircut to go with it, as you can see. Today's program, I'm going to look at a couple of, actually answers to questions that people have asked me during this program. And one of the more interesting questions that was asked recently on social media was about Nigel Farage's Reform Party. Now, I had pointed out in an X tweet, or whatever you might call it, an excretion or something like that, that the Reform Party isn't actually a party at all. It's in fact a limited company, presumably limited by guarantee and of charitable status. And someone said to me, how come if it's not a party, that Reform can gain so many votes in a general election and maybe even win seats? Well, the answer to that lies in the electoral rules. And just like any election anywhere in the UK, including here in Scotland, the Electoral Commission permits individuals to stand as so-called independent candidates. In other words, not part of a traditional party. And although we've got used to the idea of a party system whereby usually we have two parties, one occupying the right side of the political spectrum and one the left, if that still even applies, which it probably doesn't. But we've got used to this idea that political parties are the groups who actually stand candidates, but that's not the only way. And in a strange, ironic twist, Reform has actually helped the independence cause by proving that you don't need to be an actual party to stand candidates and win seats. So, in answer to this person's question, the reason Reform as a company can stand candidates is because they're standing them as independent candidates, effectively representing the views of Reform Limited or PLC, which isn't illegal under the electoral system. Like so many things in the United Kingdom, the rules are kind of vague and grey. But it does mean that anyone can stand in any election, including in the Scottish elections. As I've pointed out several times in the past, anyone who wishes to and who can come up with the required fees and basically obey the rules by having an election agent and possibly a campaign manager can stand for election in the Scottish Parliament. So that is a definite possibility, and it's another way around the constant problem of who to vote for in your second vote. Because, as you know, if you vote both votes for one party and that party wins a tremendous number of seats in the first vote, then the number of seats they could win with the same numbers of votes in the second ballot is reduced in proportion to the size of the win they had in the first vote. So it basically means it's much harder for a successful party in the first past the post part of the voting system to gain that second seat. And that's why often voting for another pro-independence party or individual in your second vote is sometimes a better way of getting more pro-independence representation at Holyrood. Now, to leave that subject for a moment and return to the one which everybody is upset about, which is Grangemouth and its imminent closure, we now know that it is being closed because the redundancy notices have been issued to all but about 90 of the remaining staff, whose job it is, presumably as the last man standing in this rather aging but still working oil refinery, to do the handover to whatever is going to come next in its stead. But the problem with losing the refinery is not simply a problem of now, which it is obviously a problem of now because we've got hundreds of people being made redundant and with no jobs to give them after this happens, and with the potential sort of industrial destruction of that site. That's going to take a long time to remediate that site. It's going to be heavily contaminated. It's going to have to be demolished. At least a lot of it is going to have to be demolished. And whatever new businesses occupy that site are going to have to build again. That's going to take time and a lot of money. And it may not produce anything like the number of jobs which were lost. We all know this. But what does the future hold? If Scotland becomes independent and does not have a refinery, that puts us in a very difficult position, because up until recently, Scotland's oil economy, if you want to call it that, because it really didn't bring much in the way of benefits to the Scottish public who own the resource. But once that oil economy is upset by not having a way to refine your own oil, it means then that even after independence, we would have to sell that oil to English refineries, which are the nearest ones, or possibly ones on the continent, to have it refined by somebody else. And that means that that oil is going to be in its crude state, unrefined, straight out of the ground. And in that state, it has a much lower value than it does once it's refined into useful products like fuels for vehicles, heating oil and chemicals and so on. So Scotland is going to lose that, and we would then be chained to either the English refining system or a continental one, neither of which is going to benefit us greatly in having control over our oil resources back. And that would leave us in a horrible situation after independence of maybe having to build a brand new refinery somewhere, either on the existing site at Grangemouth or elsewhere. And that's going to cost a tremendous amount of money and take many years to accomplish. The question really in my mind is, after independence, do we want to do that? Or do we want to do something different? Because we have been manoeuvred into a corner by the British state, which has made it attractive to INEOS to abandon that site. Now, it's not the English government which is closing the INEOS plant at Grangemouth, it's INEOS itself, and we know that Jim Ratcliffe, who owns that plant, or at least has a majority share in Petro-INEOS, doesn't particularly want to keep it open, even though it is still making modest profit. Like all oil refineries, it's been around for decades. It is aging, but it is still running, and it could be modernized, but it won't be. It's much more attractive for Mr. Ratcliffe to be given a loan guarantee by the British state as presumably a sweetener to close the Grangemouth refinery down and invest this money, which he is getting a guarantee from the British government on, into one of his other refineries on the continent, which makes more money and has a bigger market because it's not Brexited. So INEOS's business model would be better served if it operated out of Europe and not out of the UK. However, that still leaves Scotland after independence without a way to refine the crude oil which it has control over. In that situation, after independence, it might be wise for the Scottish government, whatever is voted in after independence, to take a decision to sell the rights to all of the remaining oil that exists in the Scottish sector of the North Sea, not to England, but to an oil company somewhere else for a fixed fee, and that would be billions of pounds, because the value of that crude oil is inestimable, because it's going to go up in price as its scarcity increases. And it's not necessarily true that there is going to be a massive drop-off as electric cars start to take over our streets, because, as we now know, electric cars have their own problems as well, and although they're desirable, the switch over to electric's not going to happen straight away. So there are still going to be large numbers of export markets for petrol, aviation fuel, and other derivatives of oil. So it might well be that after independence, Scotland would be wise to sell all of its remaining assets, every single litre of crude oil that still remains in the ground in our sector, to another company, not another country. Another company could make an offer on it, and they could have the exclusive rights to pump that oil out for a fixed price, but not like the wind turbine auction that happened when the Scottish government accepted a very small amount of money for a vast number of wind farm licenses. In this case, we would need to make sure that our longer term aims are met and that enough money is raised by the sale of the remaining oil in our sector to use for something much more important. Now, if we are serious about decarbonising our economy, then that money should be spent on new methods of generation. And unlike Anna Sarwar, I'm not talking about nuclear generation here, because Scotland is already overproducing electrical power. It is just a case of being able to store that in some long-term fashion that becomes a useful resource when it comes to selling it to somebody else. And it can be converted into other things. For example, hydrogen is one of the key gases which is being suggested as a heating fuel. Now, carbon is difficult but not impossible to store long term. It depends how you do it. If it is chilled down to super cold and stored as a liquid, for example, so long as it's managed correctly, you can store vast quantities of it. You can also compress the gas and sell it as a bottled fuel, which might well be the way of powering cars in the future, because a diesel engine, for example, can run on hydrogen. It's just a case of building light enough tanks that don't leak so that the car can run on it. And that is possible, and that technology has already been developed by the space industry. These are known as carbon over-wrapped pressure vessels, or COPVs. And these things are ultra lightweight, unlike the big steel tanks that normally we associate with gas canisters. These things are about a tenth of the weight, can hold vast amounts of hydrogen, easily be fitted into a car, and would mean that not all cars would need to be electric. Some of them could run on hydrogen, at least for a time. So there is a market there that we could exploit. That's just one of many markets. Now, the other market obviously would be for our gas. I'm not suggesting that we sell all our gas to England or some other corporation, but we still need it, and we will need it for years to come to heat our homes. But it's not a finite resource, and it would be wise if we are able to generate more hydrogen through our surplus green energy, like our wind turbines. If we can actually use that power to convert water into hydrogen and oxygen, then we have a fuel, a hydrogen fuel, which can be introduced into our domestic gas supply. And that is actually already being done in an experimental scheme at the moment in Scotland, to see how much hydrogen can be mixed in with our natural gas and still function. But according to what I've read in technical specifications of house boilers, they can be converted to run on pure hydrogen. And of course, it's very clean and it burns very hot and it delivers a tremendous amount of heat. So it's perfect for heating fuel. So despite Scotland losing its oil revenues from petroleum production, it is possible to reinvest what we would have made from selling the oil on for refinement somewhere else. And instead of building our own refinery, we simply channel that kind of profit back into the development of new technologies which suit the new country. In other words, where people have enough heating fuel at pretty much cost price, because it's owned by the state, to heat their homes well into the next few centuries. And that is not a problem that can't be solved. It can be solved, and the technology to do so already exists in the laboratory. But we know that hydrogen production for Scotland at the moment was under-resourced, and we know that England, or the English government, has been pulling the funding for things like carbon capture and any other form of energy management which isn't to do with the grid system that we currently have. So although Scotland is definitely going to suffer for its lack of a refinery, it does produce an opportunity for us to do something different, and we mustn't forget that it's not all problems. The English state has tried its very best to make sure that if Scotland ever does become independent, that it's going to really struggle. But I don't see that as an insurmountable problem for a country as ingenious as we are. There are plenty of scientific and engineering minds in Scotland who could easily turn this to our advantage. And that is really my message today, that in fact it's two messages. Reform has proved that we don't need parties to gain seats in elections, that we can do that ourselves. We can put up our own candidates representing whatever political cause we wish, and they can be elected under the current system. Not only that, but whether, even if England has made it impossible for us to refine what's left of our oil supply, that oil supply would still belong to us. And as long as it's in our sector, it is and should be always owned by us, the Scots who actually live here. This is our land, that's our territory, that's our oil, and it always has been, despite what anyone else says. And so I think we have a strong case after independence to simply seize back these oil fields, take them back into public ownership, and sell the potential of them, what remains in our oil reserves. And believe it or not, there's probably as much oil still in the ground as there was back in the 1970s when production started. It's just we need more licenses, and we know that there is more oil there because England has already okayed 138, I think it is, new drilling licenses to explore for new reserves. So there must be confidence that it's there. And what I'm saying to you is that if we own it, we can still exploit it, despite the obvious attempts to hamstring us by removing our only refinery. There is still the option to have a refinery anyway if we want to do it, and it might be that a smaller refinery as a backstop would spread the risks a little bit more. So we could refine perhaps half of what we bring in crude oil, and the rest could be sold on as a futures investment for another oil company, bringing in valuable investment capital that we can use in other aspects of our reindustrialization and our decarbonisation. So that's my message today. There is hope. Reform has done us a favour by proving that you don't need to be a party, you don't even need to have a party to get elected in this country. In fact, in Scotland generally, we still have the same electoral rules that England has. And we have oil resource anyway, even if the refinery is moved or closed. And that is not an insurmountable problem. So although at the moment for the next 10, 15 years, we're going to have a problem, and all the hundreds of people who used to work in Grangemouth are out on their ear, there is a future for them. But it's going to take political will to rebuild in a new way at Grangemouth and to repurpose that site into perhaps a scaled down refinery and a new way of perhaps making hydrogen and pumping it out to everybody in Scotland who needs it for heating fuel. Now, the rest of our natural gas supply can then be used and sold abroad as another resource for things like chemicals and for basically a lot of things, including plastic production. And I've also suggested that we invest some of that capital into a plastic cracker, which is a device which could take the mountains of waste plastic that exist everywhere and convert it back into natural gas, which can be sold on as a heating gas to other people. So there are so many opportunities here, and we need to just remember that the future isn't as bleak as the British state would like us to believe. Anyway, that's my message for today. So keep the faith, but remember that the next elections in 2026 will give us the opportunity to elect people who are not members of parties and who may have a much better idea of how to gain independence than those who are in parties. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.